Tell me your name, your rank, and where you live.
My name is Barney Espinosa. I come from Austin, Texas. I was born and raised there, and I still live there. After my Marine Corps career, I retired and went back home.
Why did you enlist in the Corps?
Well, my military career actually started before I enlisted in the Corps when I was 15 years old and still in junior high school, and one of my buddies told me that he had joined the Texas National Guard. And I was very naive about the military. I didn't know anything about it. And I asked him, well, aren't you supposed to be like 21 years of age before you can actually join? And he said, no, you have to be 17. And I knew he was the same age as I was. And I asked him, well, how did you do that? And he said, well, you just tell them you're 17. So after I thought about it, he encouraged me to join. And I asked, well, what do they do? And it sounded adventurous to me, which I was the type of kid that was always looking for an adventure. I went over there and I had rehearsed my new birth date. And of course I had to get my parents' consent, even at 17, the minimum age, but you did have to have your parents' consent. And that wasn't easy to do, because when I went to my parents and I told them what I wanted to do, they balked at that. They didn't like the fact that I was going to lie about my age. And my dad had not been in the military. He had worked in civil service during the war, so he didn't have to go, during World War II, that is. So I was trying to convince him that I wasn't going to leave school, that I would continue in school because that was their greatest concern, and that I was just going to attend drill meetings once a week and then 2 weeks during the summer at Fort Hood. So they finally agreed to give me their consent, and I went over to the National Guard with my new rehearsed birthday, and I joined. So that first summer, a few months later, right after school let out, I went on my first 2-week outing to Fort Hood, Texas. And I thought it was just a great adventure. I had a lot of fun. I had a total misconception of what the military was like, because these reservists or National Guardsmen were not quite up to the standards that the regular Army might have been. And so I went over there and had so much fun. It was a quartermaster unit, which meant that you dealt with supplies and drivers and such. So when I got to Fort Hood and I volunteered to be a driver, of course my dad didn't even allow me to drive the family car, and I didn't even have a license. But when I saw that there was an opportunity to drive trucks and Jeeps and all that, I asked if I could be a driver, and they said, oh, sure, you can be a driver. So I thought they were going to send me to some driving school. And instead, they filled out all the paperwork. They gave me a license. They said, there, you're a driver. So I thought, well, that was easy, but I still didn't know how to drive a truck or a Jeep. But of course, I think they saw in me an anxious young kid that wanted to drive, and they needed drivers for that first weekend. And because everybody else wanted to go into town, and I had no reason to want to go into town and drink beer. I didn't drink. So they assigned me as a duty driver for the battalion commander. So right off the bat, that's where I started, with battalion commander. They instructed me to go out on Saturday morning and check out a Jeep from the motor pool. And they said, then you report to the battalion headquarters. And being a young kid, I had no fear about what impression I would make on that battalion commander. I just went over to the motor pool and they said, okay, here's a Jeep. You need to perform a pre-maintenance check on the vehicle, which I didn't know how to do, and they had to show me that. I got in the Jeep finally, and it was a standard shift. So I didn't know how to shift, and I just bounced out of the motor pool yard like any new driver would be, and I just often wondered what they thought. Where did they send this driver from? So I reported to the battalion headquarters, And the battalion commander at some point in time came out and asked me to drive him here, drive him there. And oftentimes he would have to advise me or help me shift gears. It's funny that he never mentioned anything about my lack of driving experience, but we tooled along, and after about 3 or 4 days, they assigned me to drive a truck, a big 6x, and I took to that pretty well, and I enjoyed that. So by the end of the 2 weeks, I could drive a Jeep pretty well. I could drive a big 6x truck. I was even towing a trailer. I was more like an accident ready to happen, because oftentimes I would have a trailer load of ammunition, or I might have a truck load with gasoline jerry cans, hauling it for the tanks. So at the end of the 2 weeks, I was sold that the military was just a lot of fun. And right after the 2 weeks, we were told, it was announced that anybody that had not been on active duty and who had not been to basic training, which is the Army boot camp, that we would have an opportunity to volunteer to go to boot camp or basic training for 8 weeks, and then we could return home. So based on the fun experience that I had in Fort Hood, I thought, this is a cinch, this is great. So I'll just volunteer. So I went to I went to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas for 8 weeks of basic training. And of course it was quite different. The instructors, or they called them cadremen, were World War II veterans. And these old grizzled sergeants, I thought, were pretty rough on us. Totally different from my experience with the NCOs in the National Guard. They yelled and screamed, and I thought it was rough, but it wasn't so bad that I couldn't keep up with everybody else. And I looked at everybody around me as old guys, because they were in 20s, 22, 23. The draftees might be a little older. And there I was at 15, and so I felt like they were much older than me. But I kept up with all the training, and I did well. And at the end of my 8 weeks, I was returned back to the National Guard, and I felt like I was much more versed in the military way. So I continued with the National Guard. The following year, went to Fort Hood again. Then they asked if anybody wanted to go to another school. It was an infantry school at the same place, Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. So there I went again to Fort Chaffee and had another 8 weeks of regular Army training, returning back to Austin. And by this time I felt like I was really gung-ho, and like I began to look down at being just a truck driver in the National Guard there. So by this time I turned 17, and some of my good buddies, my peers, had turned 17, and they had joined the Marine Reserve. And they were bragging that, hey, the Marines is where it is, you know, you're over there in the Army, you know, you need to come join the Marine Corps. So that was very appealing to me. In those days of the draft, you joined or every male was, you had this obligatory service of 8 years, and it could be any combination of reserve and active duty. So when I was there at the National Guard, and I had signed up for 8 years, unless I went on active duty, I went to the Sergeant Major there when I decided I wanted to join the Marine Corps Reserve, and I asked him for a discharge, and he said, "What?" And I said, "Well, I want a discharge." And I often say now, looking back and knowing what the military is like, that if you're really stupid, you can do anything, you can get anything accomplished. Because knowing what I know now, I probably wouldn't have tried it. But I just approached the Sergeant Major and I said, "I'd like to have a discharge." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "I want to go join the Marine Corps Reserve." He said, "How many years did you sign up for?" I said, 8 years. He said, "How many years have you been here?" I said, 2. He said, "Well, come back in 6 and we'll talk about it." So I wasn't satisfied with that. I had already talked to the Marines over at the Marine Reserve, and they were enthused about me joining them, but I told them what my problem was, and being Marines, they said, "Oh, well, we'll make a few phone calls and see if we can get you a discharge." So they called over there, and then I guess that notified the National Guard that I was a little more serious, and so I had to meet with the commanding officer of the National Guard unit and the sergeant major and a few others, and they asked me questions like, what did the Marines promise you? And I said, they didn't promise me anything. I just want to go over there and join them, and I've been through this training, and I feel that it's a type of service that I'm interested in rather than just driving a truck. So finally they consented. They said, okay, we're going to give you a discharge, but don't pass the word around, otherwise everybody will be knocking on our door, you know, one in one. So happily I ran off with my discharge papers, and I went to the Marine Corps Reserve and I joined there, and by that time I was 17, and so there was no problem there. And of course I joined with the understanding that when I graduated from high school, I was either going to have to go on active duty at least for 6 months or for a full 4 years, or you can join any other service you want. Active duty, you know, that would be fine. So when I graduated I went to summer camp first for 2 years in a row, and we went to Camp Pendleton, which was much more exciting for me. It was the first time I had ever flown in an airplane. And I really enjoyed it. It was a little tougher, running up and down the hills in California at Camp Pendleton. And so when I graduated from high school, I made up my mind, not being interested in anything else that was around me that I could think of going to work in, and I wasn't interested in more schooling. My parents tried to talk me into going to college or something, and I just didn't want to have any part of that. I wasn't interested. So I went active duty in the Marine Corps, and of course I had to go through boot camp again, which at the time that I went to boot camp, I thought, well, I already know what boot camp's like, so this isn't going to be so bad. And I got there and it was a shock of my life because it was totally different. It was longer and it was much rougher. And when those drill instructors first met us, and one of them said, I'll just as soon kill you as look at you. And you think, well, that's big talk. But then he immediately demonstrated by punching some kid to the ground, and all you could hear was, oh, ow, you know, moaning and groaning. And you hear kicks and slaps. It made a big believer out of me, thinking, boy, this guy means what he says. So we went through boot camp, which was really rough, but somehow I met every challenge. It's had an appeal to me. I was motivated mostly by the fear factor, which now I think is important. I didn't believe in all that thumping or harassment when I was on the receiving end, but later on in my Marine Corps career, I came to understand how important that is to discipline, what makes the difference between a Marine and an Army guy. And I'm not putting down the other services, but there's definitely a difference in the training to begin with. So when I graduated from boot camp, they sent me off to Camp Pendleton for what they call Infantry Training Regiment, ITR. And I was there about possibly 6 weeks, and they were still harsh on us. They still hit us over the head on the helmet when we were climbing up and down the hills, because that training consisted mostly of military tactics, combat tactics. We spent a lot of time out in the field, carrying heavy loads, going up and down the hills. Camp Pendleton, everything is uphill. So we were out in the field Monday through Saturday mornings most of the time. Then we came back and had to clean all our equipment, and before we could go into town, sometimes they didn't allow us to go into town, and we might get a chance to go into town Saturday evening and Sundays, sometimes. Other times we received certain types of punishment, which required us to do some extra labor around the base camp on weekends or our time off.
Barney, could we, I'm going to turn this thing off.
All right.
That was one thing. And the other thing is, let's move forwards.
Okay.
What I'd like to see you talk more about is what made a Marine, which is the punishment also, but it's the forging.
Okay.
So go ahead and try to address what turns a man or a woman nowadays, but more what makes a man into a Marine.
Do you want me to start
Wherever you want to start.
at boot camp?
No, wherever you want to start. It's more of a feeling, changing internally.
Okay. Let me think about it a little bit. Well, I'll give it a go.
Yeah.
I don't have a clear map in my head as to where I'm going with it, but okay. Should I start?
Yeah, kind of like the idea of from the Barbary Coast to now. What is the thing? And there's not a clear idea, but you walk in someplace you can tell.
Like,
you walk in someplace you can tell if someone has
Oh.
been in the Corps.
I'm not sure I can be real clear with that.
Just to try it, and then we'll move on to something else.
Look, go ahead.
Yes.
After my infantry training there, then I learned much more about the Marine Corps. Of course, we'd had history classes all along. I understood it a little bit better, and I was able to see the whole concept of boot camp, which is really a screening course and getting you into physical shape. But as I went through infantry training, I could see how the teamwork played a part in this, a big part. And they preached that there were no individuals, that were just a team. And you worked as a team in all your tactics. You were part of a team. That inspired us, motivated us, and that's the way we bonded. And not only in the training phase of our career, but throughout the Marine Corps career, you bond with the people you're with because you're working together in whatever capacity you're working, whatever field you're in. You're going to be working together. You're always motivated by the knowledge that the Marine Corps has a long history, and that's the way things were since the beginning of the Marine Corps. The beginning of the Marine Corps history was always teamwork, and I think that history played a big part in us being so much more proud of the service that we were in. And we work together well, which causes you to just feel that you're a real buddy to each other. I mean, you're more like real brothers. When they speak about the band of brothers, that's what they're talking about, is that you feel that you're a part of something larger than you are. And eventually, as the years go by, you start beginning to feel you don't have the idea that you belong to the Marine Corps. You feel that you are the Marine Corps. And even to this date, I feel that the Marine Corps, that's my Marine Corps. And I could meet a Marine in an airport that I've never laid eyes on before, and I'll approach him, and I know so much more about that individual than if it was somebody else. I know what he's all about. I know the training he's gone through. I know about his feelings, and I totally trust that individual, even though I've never seen him before. And I always make it a point, even to this date, that if I'm in an airport and I see a Marine, I'll approach him and I'll introduce myself, and especially the young kids, and I give them encouragement. And I'll tell them, that it's a great life, and whether they believe it or not, I think they appreciate that somebody comes and talks to them and tells them about that, encouraging them to look at the Marine Corps as a career, because I certainly feel very strongly about that. When I finished with my training, then I was ready to join a regular infantry unit. And while I was in the infantry unit and we started working with helicopters, that was my first contact with Marine aviation, it kind of sparked an interest in me, and I started inquiring as to how I could get into aviation. And it took a lot of effort and such, so finally I was able to apply for aviation schooling, not knowing exactly what I would be doing, but I had to take a battery of tests. When they approved me for aviation training, they sent me to Memphis, Tennessee, to the Naval Air Station in Millington. And they had a lot, I believe they still have a lot of the Marine Corps aviation schools there. And I reported into Memphis, Tennessee. I was very impressed right away with just the living conditions. They had a two-story Navy barracks. They were open squad bay. I arrived there in February of 1960, and they were heated. And I was used to living in Quonset huts at Camp Pendleton. Poor heating. Even the heads were uphill in a separate Quonset hut, and we hardly had any hot water. Normally, you didn't have any hot water, so it was cold showers. And in California at night, it gets pretty cold, especially for a Texas boy like myself. Not used to cold anything. And so it was very uncomfortable. But when I arrived in Memphis and we were these wonderful open squad bay barracks, I thought it was just great. And the whole atmosphere was different. And so I was there for a period of about 6 months, going through training. A funny story about my stay there is that until they got enough students in, after they determined what schooling you were going to go to based on more tests, they decided that, and you get a selection, they give you a list and they say, okay, you qualify for all these schools here, you select one and we'll see about getting you into that next class. So I selected aviation operations, and it seemed interesting to me. I didn't know much about aviation, especially operations. It was just appealing to me from what little bit they introduced us to the actual working of an operations department by taking us on a tour of the airfield there at Memphis. And but until they get enough numbers to join or to make up the class, you're considered unassigned, and for a period of time until they get the correct number, whatever they were looking for. And while you're unassigned, you had to muster every morning and at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they would select certain people to do various jobs around the base, whether it was working in the kitchen as a messman, or you might be mowing grass if it was during the winter time, so there wasn't a lot of grass to mow. But if you were working out in the grounds, or any number of working in supply, any number of jobs that they might need extra hands on, they might send you there. And if they didn't have a job for you, you just roamed around aimlessly. I'd go to the library, go to the snack bar, and the barracks, going inside the barracks, especially when it was snowing outside, was very appealing to go inside and read a book. But whenever someone needed someone to go to work, they'd look in the barracks first, and if you were there, you were going to be selected to go out and do some kind of work. So you tried to hide, and there was a whole system of hiding. You'd hide between the rack and the wall, where if somebody just looked down the open squad bay, they wouldn't see you. Well, one day I was sitting there reading a book, and I got carried away, and I wasn't watching. The next thing I know is the gunnery sergeant in charge of the Marines there was right in my face, and he had a swagger stick, which was something that they did away a long time ago, but he was still carrying one at that time. They were legal. And he poked me with his stick, and I looked up, and there he is, the gunny, and I was a PFC. And he said, what do you do, young man? And I said, I'm an assigned, sir. He said, good. He said, at 1600, I want you to report to the band room. And he told me where it was. And I said, okay. And I couldn't help but ask, what am I going to do there? I thought, well, I guess I'm going to have to go clean the band room or something. He said, they need members for the Drum and Bugle Corps. And so you go down there and report to Sergeant somebody. And so I thought immediately, oh, this is going to be easy to get out of. So I told him, I don't know how to play anything. And he said, it doesn't make a shit. They want bodies, and I'm sending them a body. So you go down there and report to Sergeant so-and-so at 1600. So I thought, all right. So I was a little puzzled by it, thinking, what are they going to do with me? But as I gave it some thought, I remembered that when I was in these long chow lines in the afternoon, in the evening at 4:30 or 5, that the drum and bugle corps members would go to the head of the chow line because they had to go back and practice. You know, they practice every evening for a few hours. So they got to go to the head of the chow line. We didn't get much liberty into town, sometimes a little bit, but they got to go on parades and different functions. So I thought this wouldn't be such a bad idea to be in the drum and bugle corps, but I still had to overcome the problem that I didn't know how to play any instrument. I had no background in music, and I didn't know how I was going to get it done, but I thought about it, and I thought, I'll bet I could play a drum. And the only thing I could remember that might convince them that I played a drum was when I was in junior high school, one of my buddies played a drum, and I found out how to hold the sticks. And there's a peculiar way of holding the sticks, and I thought, I can do that, and if I tell them that I played a drum during junior high school and I just don't remember much about it, maybe I can get by, because I figured I can remember, I can copy a beat and I can get that done, even though I never tried. So I reported down there at the appointed time, and I spoke to the sergeant in charge, and he asked me, what do you play? And I said, well, I played a drum when I was in junior high school, but I said, I don't remember much about it. He said, oh, it'll be easy, you can pick it up real easy. And I said, okay, fine. So he said, go in there and where they had the instruments and get a Scotch drum, fall outside with the rest of them. So I went in there not knowing what a Scotch drum was. And so I asked somebody, what's a Scotch drum? And they said, it's the bass drum. I thought, well, that doesn't sound real glorious or glamorous. So I grabbed the thing and I went outside, and fortunately, you know, since it was new members, they have a continuous turnaround with the members, because as they finish their schooling, they're out of there and they have to get more members, new members. So we started off by practicing playing standing still in formation, but we weren't marching. So I asked, there was another Scotch drum player there, and I asked him, you know what, he said, I told him, I don't know how to read music. So he said, just follow, there's only 2 or 3 different beats, and you just follow what I do, and you'll be all right. So I did, and I was able to do that. Now, when you're marching, the troops and the band, everybody stays in step according to the bass drum, with the bass drum. So when we started marching, I could beat the correct beat, but I couldn't stay in step with the bass drum, which I was playing. So that took a little effort. It was a little awkward, but I soon was able to do that. And so I caught on very well, and I would participate in the parades, and we'd go out into town for various occasions on Saturdays and play around there in Memphis and Chattanooga and a couple other surrounding communities. And then I started school, and I continued playing with the Drum and Bugle Corps during the time I was in school, because we didn't have school on weekends. And I enjoyed the training that I was going through, the class on aviation operations. And finally, I finished school and graduated, and I felt very enthused about my new job, the prospect of going into a regular flying squadron. And so I left the Drum and Bugle Corps, and I was transferred out of Memphis about June of 1960, and I reported into El Toro, California, which was a base that's now closed, but it was a fixed wing base at that time. And they put me in a squadron that had photo reconnaissance aircraft. They are the ones that take photographs at high speed, high altitude, and they make a mosaic of all these pictures that they take, and they make a giant map out of it. So I reported into that squadron. I was very impressed with everybody that I met there. I had never been around so many lieutenants and captains, because as a grunt in Camp Pendleton, you have a lieutenant that's the platoon commander. You have a gunnery sergeant that's the company gunny, which you don't want to really have a lot to do with, because it was never good news. You didn't want to be around the sergeant major because that was worse. You didn't want to go see the company commander because that was worse too. And he would be a captain. And you definitely didn't want to go approach the battalion commander, who was probably a major or lieutenant colonel. And I mean, that was God up in the sky somewhere where you never saw, you never went there. So when I walked into the squadron, I was assigned to the Aviation Operations Department, or what they call the S3. They were knee deep in lieutenants and captains, and my boss was a major, very impressive individual. He had been a World War II pilot. He had fought in Korea. He was a pilot in Korea. He was prisoner of war in Korea. And it just amazed me, the friendliness that I was met with, and everyone that I was introduced with was very friendly regardless of the ranks, and I just thought I was in heaven. It was great. The barracks, the living conditions were great. We were working mostly 7:30 to 4:30. We got off most Saturdays and Sundays. Then we deployed. We went to the deserts in Fallon, Nevada. We'd go to Yuma, Arizona. We'd stay a month. And all that appealed to me and my want to travel, see new places and all that. And we were forming to go to Japan, which was going to be my first experience going overseas, which I was really looking forward to. It was one of my goals to be in the Marine Corps and to go places. And so I was very excited about being there and getting ready to go to Japan. And so I had a good time while I was there at El Toro. And in 1962, we did deploy to Iwakuni, Japan, and that was my first deployment overseas. And again, the camaraderie that I was building with these people, the leadership that I was seeing, these wonderful role models, which served me for the rest of my career in the Marine Corps, and still to this day. This is where I learned leadership. This is what I learned what a leader's like. This is what I learned of how to handle troops, how to overcome situations. Just so much that I was getting my real education right there. And I loved everything, every aspect of it. We went overseas, and it was just wonderful because we were stationed in Iwakuni, Japan, but we would spend a month deployed. Part of us would be deployed to Korea. Part of us would be deployed to the Philippines. And then we'd come back, and then people would switch. You might stay there in Iwakuni, or you might go off to Taiwan, or you might go switch roles and go to a different place, back to Korea. If you came out of the Philippines, you go to Korea. And I loved all that moving around. We'd go aboard ship for a few weeks. And it was continuous moving the whole 13 months that I was there. When I finished, when I was about ready to finish that tour of duty, and I got promoted to corporal, and it was about time for me to decide whether I was going to re-enlist or just finish out my last year and get out of the Marine Corps. And this was about the time that we were ready to rotate back to the States, and then we were going to go to the winds. We were going to be reassigned to different units, different locations. We're all going to split up. Well, at that point, I thought, if I get out of the Marine Corps now, I'm never going to get to do this, to travel, to have the camaraderie, to enjoy the camaraderie, to do all this that was wonderful to me. And I thought, I want to do this some more. And so that's when I was convinced that, yeah, I'm going to re-enlist, which was a total turnaround from the first couple of months of being in boot camp, when I thought, I made a mistake and there's no way I can make a career out of the Marine Corps because this is not going to work. So I was at that point where I had made a radical change in my attitude towards the Marine Corps, and I came to learn to love it. So I did re-enlist, and I re-enlisted for 6 years, and which was the maximum time. I re-enlisted and I was sent to the helicopter base at Santa Ana, California, which is sort of across the highway from the fixed wing base of El Toro, where I was stationed before. So I went to helicopters over there at Santa Ana, California, and I worked in flight clearance, which was not a squadron, but you're part of the station. And flight clearance is where the pilots come in, file the flight plans, and you coordinate flight following with the FAA and the other bases wherever the plane might be going to. But we mostly just dealt with helicopters, with all the tenant units that were there. There was one Marine Aircraft Group. It was Marine Aircraft Group 36. And I don't remember how many units there were, but there were the heavy helicopters, and then there were the regular troop carriers, which at that time were the UH-34D, Sikorsky aircraft. And that's what the Marine Corps used to haul infantry troops. And they hauled, I believe, 8 to 10 fully loaded combat troops. And, excuse me.
Let's get to more like the Squadron 263 and the Vietnam, because you know what it is. It's 12:30 already.
Oh yeah. Well,
I don't want you to miss your chow too.
Well, I'm not too worried about the chow. It's up to you. You know, I'm not real hungry right. Well, I probably need to eat something. How about another 30 minutes?
Yeah.
And then we'll come back, or what?
Yeah, whatever. Go back.
Do you want me to go to my first Vietnam assignment?
Yeah, let's go to what it was like to go to Vietnam. What it was like to be assigned, you know, to your position on the helicopters, and get your feelings about that.
Okay. Are we ready?
Yes. We're still rolling.
Okay. So I worked in flight clearance there, and I arrived in there just about a week before the date that everybody remembers, if you were alive, when JFK was assassinated in Dallas. And I had just arrived there in Santa Ana. That was in November of 1963. And I worked there. I didn't like shift work. I enjoyed the type of work that I was doing, but we worked in shifts, and I wasn't too crazy about that. In the spring of 1965, when right after the Gulf of Tonkin, when LBJ decided to send in combat troops to Vietnam, up to that time they had advisors, but this time they were sending full force of combat troops. Then that Marine Aircraft Group, which meant all the units, helicopter units there, were going to be shipped to Vietnam. And so I was pulled out of my current position, and I was assigned to the Marine Aircraft Group, and we were loaded aboard the USS Princeton, which was located at Long Beach. We got short notice. They said, be ready to move out, get all your gear, and we're moving out, loading aboard the Princeton. So I was very excited because some of the friends that I had in infantry units had already moved out, had already left California. And I thought, surely they're not going to have a war and I'm going to miss out. I wanted to go badly. And I thought, this will be very disappointing if they have a war and I'm sitting here. So I was very anxious to go. There was no way I was going to miss out on that. It's like preparing for the big game and then they leave you sitting on the bench. And little did I know that nobody was going to miss out, but I felt that way at that time. I had a big burning desire to go into a combat environment. I had no idea what it was going to be like, but I wanted to go. I wanted to find out about myself too. So when they give us the word that we were going to load up on the USS Princeton, I was very excited. I got aboard. We went aboard one day, and it took about 24 hours to load everything on that ship. The helicopters are not loaded there at the pier side. They have to fly and catch up with the ship. After the ship pulls out, they're out in open ocean, then the helicopters are flown aboard. So 24 hours after we arrived there and we loaded the ship and everything, we pulled out of there. And we went out to the open sea, and then our helicopters caught up, and that meant all the helicopters of the group, all the units. So we had, I don't know how many thousands of troops aboard, and we had infantry units too. And so we were in the Princeton. The Princeton was an old ship. It didn't even have air conditioning. And so we set sail, and during our time on the ship, we had classes on map reading. We had lectures or briefings on the area that we were going to go into in Vietnam. At that time, none of us knew anything about Vietnam. We weren't even sure geographically where it was located. And so we started learning about that. We were shown some aerial photos of the area that we might go into, or we were going into. We were getting acclimatized by running on the deck, and especially once we passed Hawaii, it kept getting hotter and hotter. It took us about 5 days to get to Hawaii. We had a brief stop there to get some extra supplemental clothing, boots, socks, things like that, and then we were off again from Hawaii. And it kept getting hotter, and then they told us that we didn't have to work, we didn't have to sleep downstairs anymore. I mean, we were down in a compartment that was not very big. There were 80 people in the compartment. The racks were 6 high, and they were very close together. Our sea bags were in the middle. There was no ventilation, and it wasn't just hot, you couldn't hardly breathe. So once we passed Hawaii, they said, you can go ahead and sleep out on the deck, and if you want to. Well, we'd go out on the deck, and it was much more comfortable, but it was raining all the time. And of course, this helped us acclimatize to the real weather we were going to be faced with when we arrived in Vietnam, because it was all rain, mud, and heat. And we kept doing our exercises with wearing our flak vest and equipment every day on the flight deck. We'd do calisthenics and we'd run, but with our gear on, which helped. And we finally arrived in Subic Bay, and they allowed us off the ship we were there probably 2 days, 2 nights. And they said, go out and have your fun, because it's the last one you're going to have. So we went out, drank San Miguel beer, ran around QB Point, or Olongapo is the little town right outside of Subic Bay. Every Marine and sailor is familiar with that. I had been there before when I had been on my previous overseas assignment and went to the Philippines. I had spent a lot of time in Subic Bay. So we had our 2 days of liberty there, and then got back on the ship and departed Subic Bay early one morning, and we were scheduled to make our big landing in Vietnam the following morning, probably starting about 3 o'clock in the morning. So we got all our gear ready, and the heat was unbearable almost, and we had breakfast. They started serving breakfast about 9 o'clock at night, and it's traditional that Marines get a steak and egg breakfast before a combat landing. So they had the traditional breakfast of steak and eggs, excuse me, and they had the sailors had a giant cake that said "Good luck, Marines," and so it made you feel like you were really going to a combat zone. What really made me feel that I was going into a combat zone, the reality of it, was the evening before, when they called us down on the hangar deck, which is the space for the aircraft storage right beneath the flight deck, and they issued ammunition. Because in the Marine Corps, throughout training, they don't give you ammunition very freely. It's tightly controlled. It's accounted for. Even when you're in the range, they give you 5 rounds to load. You get the 5 rounds. If you don't fire one, they collect it. So it's tightly controlled. Anything the live ammunition is tightly controlled. So here they were giving us ammunition, issuing ammunition. They told us to load up our magazines. So that brings it home like, hey, we're really going into a combat zone, you know. And it wasn't scary for me. It was just, I was anxious. I was excited. I was curious. you know, how was it going to be, what was it going to be like, but nothing like worry or anything like that. So the following, we hardly slept because we had breakfast and then we had to get suited up and get down to the flight deck. They divided us into what they call helo teams as to who was going to be in which helicopter and at what time you would leave, depart, and the sailors have the big plan, and there's a sign that shows what helo team you're in, and eventually the sailors make it to your team when it's time to go, and they lead you all the way up to the flight deck. They line you up where your plane's going to be. The planes are turning up, and the excitement, the adrenaline is building up in you because you get out there, you hear the helicopters going, and it's in the dark, and you're loaded down with your pack and your rifle, and you got your magazines, and this is your first introduction to a combat zone. And for me, it was excitement, curiosity. I don't remember fear. It was just a lot of different emotions, but I don't think I ever thought, oh, you know, I hope I'm okay or whatever. It didn't enter my mind that way. So we flew out, and I knew that there wasn't a base where we were going to, but I kept looking out the window. I don't know how far at sea we were, probably 15, 20 minutes, maybe not that long, 15 minutes maybe from the ship to the shore. And we went to the, as we were flying along, I kept checking out the window of the helicopter, and the wind's blowing in your face, you know, and because they opened the door, I mean, the door is wide open. The noise of the helicopter, everybody's in the dark, and I'm peering out the window, somehow thinking I'll see some kind of blinking lights or some kind of lighting up there. There was just pure dark. It was a real dark night. I mean, there might have been stars, but I couldn't see any. I couldn't make out any ground features. I couldn't see anything. And so we just kept headed for shore. So I kept looking out the window, you know, somehow knowing that there's no one out there, but at the same time kind of looking for lights, which weren't there, of course. But the adrenaline was building, and so we made our landing. We knew exactly what we were supposed to do. And we were supposed to form what they call a hasty defense. When you get out of the helicopter, you spread out in a defense, in a defensive position. The helicopter takes off and goes, but this is in case somebody were to attack you as you're getting off the aircraft and all that. And we really were not expecting an attack or anything to happen at that point, but the potential is there. You know, we were in a combat zone. And our backs were to the sea. We were on top of these cliffs, later to be known as Geoghegan, and which ended up later when they built Chulai Air Base. That was about 2 miles away from us. And we were probably perhaps 50 miles south of Da Nang. You know, for those are the common names that people might be familiar with, but I'm not sure of the mileage exactly. So we landed there, made our hasty defense, and then we were told that when we got the word as the other helicopters were coming in that we were to move forward, and about 500 yards away or so, maybe more, there was like a dry gully out there, and we moved towards that dry gully, and we hadn't been there long before it started raining, and this could have been 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm not sure. And it started raining. Of course, it was very hot. It was in the month, well, it was in the spring, I'm not sure what month, or early summer of '65. And it started to rain, and we put on our ponchos, which in those days, after you're soaked and wet, the poncho would get so damp on the inside also that you were wet inside and out. And the main thing is to try to keep your weapons dry. So we were there, and then it didn't take long before they started saying, okay, you need to dig in, and we started digging holes. And at first everybody was quiet, everything was dark, and they said don't light cigarettes and keep the noise down. And as Marines go, you know, after a while you start getting a little more comfortable, and guys start laughing, you know, humor is, I think it's very important to make you get through some of these situations. And I'm a person that is always joking and such. So, but Marines in general have a lot of humor, and pretty soon guys have started cracking up, and you have to tell them, hey, knock it off, keep it down, quit yelling, and all that kind of stuff. So pretty soon we're digging holes, and in the rain, without gloves, that entrenching tool slips and slides in your hand. So it didn't take long before we were developing blisters. We were soaking wet, we were already covered with mud, dug a hole. I don't think it was very long after a few hours, and the daylight began to show, and we had to move forward again, so we had to dig another hole. And we did this. So then after the sun came up, of course, it started getting very hot, and it was still raining. And then we started, they started sending a number of us to go back to the beach as the helicopters were continuously shuttling troops, and then they were bringing in supplies. So we had to go back down the hill from where we were and go back. By this time we were maybe almost half a mile from shore. Go back over there and start hauling boxes of ammunition, all sorts of gear, rations, just all the supplies, moving them forward. And so it was all day work and digging and laying barbed wire and doing all those sorts of things. That night they told us to be on special alert, and we had two guys to a foxhole, and they told us that, you know, make sure we had 50% watch, and one guy could sleep a little bit, the other guy had to stay awake, and the sides of the holes and trenches were caving in because of the mud. And they said, don't get out of your holes, because the Marines, you know, you probably get shot by the other Marines, so you had to stay in your hole, you couldn't get out. And that night, all of us, most of us were green and being in combat, so there was a lot of shooting going on, and nobody really knew what we were shooting at. And there were some old timers, like this gunnery sergeant that was in charge of my group. He had been in Korea, and he was very fond of telling us, which again it falls into Marine humor, but he wasn't laughing when we were on the ship, and every day he would muster us, and he would say, 24 hours after we hit the beach, half of you are not going to be around. And we'd say, oh, thanks, Gunny, it makes me feel real good. But it was a big joke. So he was there, and I mean, he would work on building our morale. You know, I can look back on it and know that all this kind of stuff was to humor us and make us feel more relaxed, perhaps, and it worked. I mean, we were always laughing, even in that situation. So there was no fear. That first day, a lot of people were passing out from the heat. I mean, it was horrible. I mean, it was just like somebody turned hot lamps on you. And working, so people were passing out. We were soaking wet. Our ponchos by this time when we're hauling heavy boxes, they were shredded, so they were useless. And we were just trying to keep that weapon oiled and dry, or at least oiled, so that we could shoot it and out of the mud. That night, it was a long, long night. There was shooting. I don't know that we got fired on, but there was a lot of shooting going around, mostly from the Marines. And by this time, our perimeter had expanded. We probably covered a couple of miles, perhaps. And we, when the sun started coming up, by this time, I hadn't slept much on the last night at the ship. I had been working all day. I had blisters in my hands. I'd been eating rations. I was very tired from lack of sleep, and I was soaking wet, and I was, you know, it's pretty demoralizing, covered with mud. And I thought to myself, as I was analyzing how I felt and all, I thought, it seems to me like I've been here 6 months. And I thought, and there's all this shooting, and I feel exhausted, and then I think, I'm here for 13 months and this is day one. I thought, how in the heck am I gonna make it? Because it was just, I thought, how am I gonna do this, you know? Because I felt exhausted, tired, and it works on your morale a little bit when you're covered with mud, and it's not like being on a camping trip when you say, hey, Friday we'll go take a shower, sleep in a clean bed, get a good meal. There was no outlook for that. All I could think of is 13 months, and this is day one. So I thought, this is going to be a long tour. And that's basically my feeling at that time. Not fear or anything, just like, this is going to be a long, long time. So from there, it was working parties, it was more digging, it was building trenches, building bunkers, filling sandbags, having perimeter watch, unloading the civilian merchant ships that would come in offshore, and they had lumber and they had all sorts of things, so we had to send working parties aboard ship, these rust buckets, and work in the holds of those ships, which were very hot. And our food was just sea rations. And pretty soon, the sea rations, and these were the same type that they had in World War II in Korea, because they were old cans, consisting of things like spaghetti and meatballs, ham and lima beans, which we call ham and mothers, tuna casserole, I think. They had these steak and potatoes. The first time you would taste one of these, it tastes good, but after about 2 or 3 days of it, they taste kind of medicine-y. The preservatives, I suppose, not very appealing. And pretty soon, you in the heat, you don't feel like eating all this. So you start eating the fruit can, the cheese, the peanut butter, the jam, the crackers, and forget that other stuff. And plus, most of the time, we were eating it cold. You had an opportunity to heat it sometimes, but in the monsoons and the rains, you weren't going to build a fire. So it was tough going. Sometimes we could make ourselves a cup of coffee with the instant coffee that was included in the sea ration packet. And you use rainwater, because our drinking water came from local wells, I suppose, and it was heavily chlorinated, and they would put salt in it, to replace the salts we were losing through sweat. So they would encourage you to drink this water, but we were rationed on the water also. We didn't have a lot of water. So they told us, this water is for drinking. It's not for shaving. It's not for washing clothes. It's not for bathing. Just drinking. And so out of a canteen cup of water, I would brush my teeth. I would use that to kind of sponge off, and because you're sweating, you're covered with dirt. And out of one canteen of water, I would do all this in the mornings and shave. And I didn't have a heavy beard, so I only had to shave maybe every couple of days. And sometimes dry shave, we could do that. But the living conditions were primitive, and we were using our pup tents, which didn't work very well in the monsoons. Everything's muddy. And then when it dried, we were covered in a red dirt, and you're sweating, and then it would rain, and we would get out in the rain and take a bar of soap and wash our clothes on us. Then you think that you're rinsing off, and you take those clothes off, and then you take a shower in the rain, and then you rinse off, and then you put your wet clothes back on, and you felt like you had cleaned yourself a little bit. But when you dry, you smell like mildew. It's like a wet rag that's been thrown out in the corner and left there for a couple of days. You just stink like mildew. Pretty soon you don't notice it, because everybody smells the same, and everybody's covered with red dirt. You just have this red tint to you. And they had told us that we didn't have to shave every day, but they said you can't grow a beard. So the guys that had heavy beards, they had to shave every day, even if it was dry shaving. And then we had hand clippers that everybody had to keep their hair trimmed. So we were all barbers to each other with hand clippers, because there was no electricity. And it was not like you see in the movies, where you see guys, not Marines, but you see guys in combat with a long hair and bandanas. We weren't allowed to do any of that. No collection of beads around our neck, on our wrists. In those days, the hippie era, that was kind of the going thing in civilians. The hippies with the beads and all that. You could wear dog tags. You could wear a religious medal. But you had to keep your hair cut. and you couldn't have a beard, so none of that you see in the movies. So we, it was all working parties and such. I finally got transferred into a squadron, a flying squadron, because when I went over there, I wasn't attached to a flying squadron yet. And I was trying to network and trying to connect with the flying squadron. And I finally was able to get myself into a flying squadron, which was HMM-263, later to be known as the Purple Foxes, and still currently serving in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and wherever they might be, but it's an active squadron. And I went over there, and I went as the operations chief for the S3 department. I was a sergeant at that time, and I enjoyed working in the squadron. But of course, once I was in the squadron, then I wanted to volunteer to be a gunner in a helicopter. So if you're foolish enough to want to be a gunner, they'll take you. You know, you don't, because otherwise I was not in a flying status. I wasn't a crew chief, I wasn't a mechanic. But if you want to be a gunner, you can be, it doesn't matter what field you're in. So I said, I want to be a gunner. So I said, sure, you can be a gunner. So in the 34, we had the M60 machine guns. And again, I was very excited about doing that. I was very anxious to get it done. And fear didn't enter me until the first shooting, the first time we got into a situation like that. Then you do feel the adrenaline, but I can't say real fear. To me, the fear or the most stressful part of being a gunner was the flying. For some reason, when it came to the flying and you're around the trees and you're around the mountains and you're making tight landings through trees, that's when, because you realize the danger that if those blades get destroyed, you're going to fall out of the sky. And we commonly, in Marine humor, would refer to helicopters as the crowd killers. They said because when the chopper goes down, everybody dies. But it didn't discourage us from flying. Not me, anyway. And so if I got the fear of God in me when I was out there in the shooting, sometimes you'd feel like this is bad. Immediately afterwards, you feel that high. It's followed by a high that I used to say, this is better than any drug or beer or alcohol or anything could do for you. I've never been a drug user of any type. But that's the way you felt, this high that makes you want to go back. You know, instead of discouraging you, you just crave that. You think, I want to do it again. 10 minutes before, you swore to God, get me out of here. I don't think I want to do this. But it changes as soon as you're out of that type of situation. So I flew missions, medevacs, troop insertions. We had our close calls. We had all kinds of adventure. You know, it was just everything what you felt you were really in a combat situation. And there's a bond in there with the crew members, the pilots, the enlisted guys. You just bond together, and that's the way it's always been in helicopters, because you're there together sharing in that experience, whether it's good, bad, no matter how scary it is. The pilot's depending on those crew members, the crew members are depending on that pilot. And then you learn that that pilot will get you out. You have that confidence, not only because they're Marines, because they're good pilots. And in the worst of situations, they come through. And I mean, I have a lot of respect for those pilots, because they can pull you out under extremely difficult situations. So I went through, and it made the time go by faster. Later on, we got loaded aboard ship. Again, we operated off the coast of Vietnam for about 3 months. Then we got some liberty, going into the Philippines, going into Okinawa. In one of those trips into Okinawa, which were to pick up troops and replenishment and all that, I found out that my younger brother, I only have one brother, he had joined the Marine Corps sometime around the time I got to Vietnam. So when we were aboard ship, I had already been in country about approaching 9 months perhaps. And we were going to go into Okinawa, and I received a letter from my mother telling me that my brother was on his way to Vietnam, and he was going to be in Okinawa, which was the usual stop for about 2 or 3 days before you went on into country. So it coincided with us arriving in Okinawa. So when I arrived there, I started calling to the base where I knew the troops would be in. And so I found him, and he was restricted already because they were leaving that night for Vietnam. And he was a grunt in the infantry. He was a machine gunner. And so I went over there to that base. I was familiar with it, and found him. And so we got to talk for a while, and then we visited for a couple of hours. And then he left that night, and I went back to my ship and continued. After a couple of days in Okinawa, we continued operating off the coast. And after 3 months, we landed back ashore at Kiha, which by this time resembled more of a base. We had all built it by hand, everything from laying the planking down for the helicopter landing pads, the parking areas. We had all participated in that, physically hauling these heavy steel plankings and putting them together. We built 2 pads that were 600 by 900 feet each. And we had tents for working areas, and then in some cases they had what we call hardbacks, which was a wooden frame with GP tent draped over the top of it, sides rolled up. So that's where I was when I finished that tour, and by this time I had been there a little over 13 months. And at that point, I was ready to come home and all that, but I wasn't anxious. I was thinking, well, I was acclimatized to the routine. We worked 7 days a week, little sleep, and I thought, yeah, it's time for me to go home. They'll come and get me, because I had no paperwork on me. And the numbers were dwindling because they had transferred a lot of us out, and the squadron was going to dismantle, come back to the States and pick up new aircraft and then go back to Vietnam. Different people, but the squadron colors. So I wasn't too worried about that. I was used to the routine, used to the heat, used to the everything, the dangers, whatever. And so I finally got out of the country there, and I was sent to Beaufort, South Carolina, where I was in a fixed-wing aircraft squadron. Because of my MOS working in operations, I can work helicopters, I could work transport planes, jet aircraft, or base operations. And so I went to a fighter attack helicopter. They had F-4 planes. I was there for 1 year, and then I received orders to go to Hawaii, and I had never been to Hawaii. And so, except passing through on the ship, went on my way to Vietnam for a few hours, but I had never been stationed there. So I went, took my family with me. I had 2 kids at that time, very young, and we went to Hawaii, and I worked in base operations, which is the airfield, management of the airfield. And I worked there, enjoyed that, and normally that is a 3-year tour, 36 months. But I was there 20 months, and then I received orders again to go to Vietnam. And I had let it be known that I wanted to go back to Vietnam. When I wanted to go the first time, when I left Vietnam, I thought, this has been bad and all that, but I'll come back. I just knew I wanted to come back. And I'm not sure why, but I guess because that was where the action was. That's where I wanted to be. You're a Marine, you want to be where there's action. And I didn't leave there with a feeling like, oh, I never want to go back there again. No, I wanted to do it again. And so whenever it came time to tell somebody, I'd say, yeah, I want to go back to Vietnam, So having stayed in the Marine Corps, they were probably going to send me anyway. Everybody was returned to Vietnam, usually after a couple of years.